That's where it's gotten to. So what I want to say is that we've gotten to a point at which, even though on the one hand we are discouraged, and in some ways it's even terrifying to watch, to observe the path that we're on the other hand, there's something very encouraging going on in that traditionally we have labored under the thumb of what we might call gatekeepers of opinion. Institutions that make certain that certain opinions are not heard. The general public is not allowed to consider them. Gatekeepers of opinion that make sure that debates are confined to safe and utterly trivial, unimportant and foolish parameters. So it's okay for us to debate, well gee, let's say the federal government should probably take at least 40% of income. So how should they do it? Should they take it this way or should they take it that way? The New York Times has no problem whatsoever if that's what we're arguing about. No problem whatsoever. That sort of thing, or should the Department of Education impose this type of program on the schools in the country, or should it impose that kind of program? Again, the Washington Post is not losing any sleep over a debate like that. Those are the gatekeepers. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the cable news channels, and so on and so forth. It's their job to make sure that the regime gets to dominate the terms of debate. But what we started to see, and more than I've ever seen before, I mean, I'm not super old, but I've been around a little while, and I've never seen anything quite like this, is that we are now able to have serious discussions about issues that we are so not supposed to talk about. That the gatekeepers, I mean, seriously, are just, they have to be practically hospitalized when they look at what we're talking about these days. So what has been happening is, the way my friend Gary North puts it is, he says, yes, it's true, the gates are still up. The gatekeepers are still there. There's still an MSNBC, you know, there's still a Newsweek, there's still a U.S. News and World Report. The gates are still there, but the walls are down. So sure, there's a gate, you just walk right around it now. And now we all know, we've heard a lot of cliches about the internet, and it really liberates us, but that's not a cliche. It's unbelievable what this has made possible. And the first thing I want to talk about before we talk about nullification, which is an example of this phenomenon. I mean, would we have ever been allowed to talk about state nullification? Would never have been allowed. We wouldn't have been able to get started. It would not have happened. But I want to just say just a little something about a subject that's sort of dear to my heart. Probably none of you, but just me, the Federal Reserve System. Anybody ever talk about this to your friends and family? Oh, man. Boy, your relatives love when you bring up this subject. Their favorite. Oh, Uncle So-and-so is talking about the Fed. That's great. I think I'll have another drink. But the interesting thing is that suddenly now, people realize the Fed is something you're entitled to an opinion on. Before, it would not be mentioned. Now, it might be mentioned to praise it. Oh, thank goodness for this wonderful institution that provides stability, and without it, we would all revert instantly to barbarism. You get something like that. But even that would be discouraged, because you really don't want people looking at it too closely even to praise it. You really just want to keep it in the background. Don't really let it seep right out into the general public's consciousness all that much. But now, a couple of factors have converged to make the Fed something that is on the table. Now, this is not the best example in the world, but I will give an example involving one of my own children. Now, in fact, because I'm not using the microphone, I'm free to walk over here. I'm going to walk over here, get myself some water, and keep telling you about my 7-year-old. So I have a 7-year-old. We have 4 children. They're all girls. The youngest is 7 months. The oldest is 7 years. So we got quite a ways ahead of us here. The 7-year-old is 7 going on 47. And I'm just amazed by her. Before we had children, I was like typical guy. Typical guy is like, you've seen one baby, you've seen them all. You're like, yeah, gaga, yeah, whatever. But I am just such a, I don't want to say pushover, because I don't give them everything they want, but I'm just amazed and fascinated by them every single day, everything they do and the way they think. And so Regina is the name of our oldest. she was talking with one of her friends, who happens to be the daughter of Jeff Tucker from the Mises Institute, if anybody heard of him. And her daughter, Jeff's daughter, reads a lot of old-timey, like 19th century stories. She'd been reading a story about penny candy, involving where kids could go get penny candy. Now, of course, penny candy existed into the 20th century, but this was an old-timey story, and she asked my daughter, Regina, so what do you think about that story? I mean, I think it's kind of silly, because, you know, a penny hardly buys anything. And my daughter said, yeah, thanks to the Fed. Now, I don't say that because my daughter, who is rather a captive audience, is saying things like this, that means the world is changing. But the fact that I'm talking about this so much is partly a reflection of how excited I am that this is a live issue, that I can write about this, and there's an audience for it. Other people write about this, people are listening. And there are a couple of factors that converge to make this possible. Of course, there was the financial crisis. Now, obviously, during a crisis, people are much more open to listening to heterodox points of view. They don't necessarily want to hear the establishment line. The establishment line was, there ain't no crisis, there's nothing wrong. So you don't necessarily want to listen to these people explain how everything went wrong, because they obviously didn't see it. So there's an interest in looking around for alternatives. And thankfully, the intellectual infrastructure was in place to provide that alternative, to provide the critique of the Federal Reserve as an institution that brings about this instability by its interference with interest rates. And the second factor, of course, was Ron Paul, because he brought this up. He actually made an issue out of this. Now, this is very unusual, that you're not supposed to do that, not only because it's the Federal Reserve, but also because this is an issue no voter was really thinking about. I mean, other than, you know, people in this room and whatever, but nobody knew that there was a group thinking about it. Normally what a politician does is he has his focus groups. You know, by the way, don't utter any vulgarities here, but he hires somebody like Frank Luntz. Now, I know what some of you want to say about Frank Luntz. Don't say it. You hire somebody like that, and he asks the rubes what's worrying them, and they give their answers, and the politicians just throw some red meat to them and then betray them at the first opportunity. That's the usual pattern. That's how our system works. Ron Paul wants to make as a central issue something no one was even thinking about, much less concerned about. This is very unusual, and for that reason, at the time, I actually said, and it's still up there for the world to see, I posted a blog post saying, this is a big mistake, Ron Paul, I love him, you know, I would crawl over broken glass for this guy, but he is wrong to be talking about the Fed, no one's going to understand this, it's going to go right over people's heads, it's a big mistake. Well, thank goodness no one ever listens to me, because what an idiotic thing that was to say, because I think a good chunk of his success came from people who were newly energized because for the first time somebody mentions the elephant in the living room. This has never happened before. Well, what major political candidate has ever made an issue with the Federal Reserve? Never. And now it's gotten to a point where this is taken seriously. The Austrian School of Economics, to which Ron Paul subscribes, that critiques the Fed from a free market perspective, says if you believe in the free market, you shouldn't favor a coercive money monopoly. This seems like a contradiction. Suddenly now, this is becoming mainstream. It used to, when Ron Paul first started talking about it, it was, oh, that Ron Paul, what a crank he is. Whereas now, you've got financial analysts, you've got people on Wall Street, you've got all these investment experts who understand the so-called Austrian, what's called the Austrian theory of the business cycle, understand what happens when the central bank does what the central bank has been doing, when it interferes with interest rates. What happens to the economy? They understand this, and now it's sort of like, yeah, sure, Austrian theory of the business cycle, sure, we all know that. So now suddenly it's become, I mean, if not the mainstream view, certainly very respectable. It's treated respectfully. A lot of people know about it. And so, yeah, there are still going to be some neoconservatives who like to make fun of Ron Paul. Say, cranky old Ron Paul, you know, doesn't he know that the Federal Reserve is the great stabilizer or whatever? Yeah, I mean, you still have that. But I'm talking about people who are actually willing to crack open a book, to read and to rethink their own assumptions. And there are very few people in the country who do that, you know, ourselves included. A lot of times we feel like, I just want to read what's going to reaffirm my own views. But enough of them, enough Americans were shaken up by the financial